During his presidential campaign in 1960, John F. Kennedy had promised the most ambitious domestic agenda since the New Deal, the New Frontier, a package of laws and reforms that sought to eliminate injustice and inequality in the United States. It was not until 1964, after Kennedy was shot, that President Lyndon B. Johnson could muster the political capital to enact his own expansive program of reforms. The Berlin Wall began construction on August 13, 1961, to keep Western fascists from entering East Germany and undermining the socialist state. In April 1961, the CIA launched what its leaders believed would be the definitive strike, a full-scale invasion of Cuba. However, the invaders were badly outnumbered by Castro's troops, and they surrendered after less than 24 hours of fighting. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US and the Soviet Union engaged in a tense political and military standoff in October 1962 over the installation of nuclear-armed Soviet missiles on Cuba. In the end, disaster was avoided when Khrushchev removed the Cuban missiles in exchange for the US promising not to invade Cuba. The optimistic 60s went sour in 1968. The Democratic Party split, and Johnson went on to television to announce that he was ending his re-election campaign. Richard Nixon won the election that fall. Martin Luther King Jr., Robert Kennedy, and Malcolm X, the most visible civil rights activists in American politics, were assassinated.
In the 1960s, America's economy was subjugated by housing and the computer industry, rather than automobiles and chemicals. Throughout the ups and downs of the economy, Kennedy and Johnson's leadership proved to be beneficial for the opulence of America. However, the recession began during the 1960 election, and Kennedy was determined to increase economic growth and decrease unemployment. Regardless of deficit concerns, Kennedy pushed for a tax cut to help the public. While he struggled to get it passed in the House of Representatives, he was assassinated in 1963, leaving his wish unfulfilled. But Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took over, and the House of Representatives affirmed the tax cut. Thus, the Kennedy-Johnson tax cut of 1964 was a major stepstone in economic prosperity of the people. The War on Poverty amalgamated Lyndon B. Johnson's attempts to reduce poverty in the late 1960s. It consisted of programs of government assistance, including the Social Security Amendments of 1965, the Food Stamp Act of 1964, the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act.
On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, which in turn began the historic space race. Many Americans viewed the Russians as enemies, and because of this, the space race was so crucial. A year after the Soviets launched Sputnik, the United States launched Explorer 1. During this year, President Eisenhower also created NASA. In 1961, the USSR sent the first human into orbit, which prompted the US to play a huge game of catch-up. That same year, the new President Kennedy announced that before the decade was over, they would put a man on the moon. On December 28, 1968, the first manned space mission to orbit the moon took place. 6 months later, on July 20, 1969, the Apollo 11 lunar module landed on the moon, and Neil Armstrong said his famous words that would be repeated for generations after.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
These effectively ended the space race and proved that the United States overshadowed the Russian space program. Other important inventions for the United States during this time period included the laser, the operating system, and the mini-computer. The laser would later impact the medical field by making it possible to perform surgeries to destroy retinal tumors. The first mass-produced computer operating system meant that all computers in the IBM 360 family could run all software programs. A year after, the mini-computer would directly influence the production of computers in the future. Congress also created Medicare and Medicaid in the mid-1960s. Medicaid to help low-income families pay for health care, and Medicare to help the elderly once they reach the age of 65. These plans are still being used today. The 1960s were a period of reform that focused primarily on political movements for black rights, gay rights, and ideals such as free love. Popular sayings of this time period included out of sight, nitty-gritty, hip, groovin', etc. The 1968 Olympics were revolutionary because of gold medalist Tommy Smith and bronze medalist John Carlos, who raised gloved fists in support of black power, which angered many. People during this time period were more likely to speak out, and the gay rights movement was a reflection of the ideology of free love. The Stonewall Riot of 1969 was in part because of police targeting the gay community. People threw bottles at policemen until the riot police eventually dispersed them. This marked the first major movement regarding equal rights for homosexuals. The beginning of the 1960s Black Rights Movement began on May 4, 1961, when a group of 13 African American and white civil rights activists launched the Freedom Rides, intended to protest segregation in bus terminals. African American Freedom Riders defied every hindrance imposed upon them and used white-only restrooms, water fountains, etc. In September 1961, the Interstate Commerce Commission issued regulations prohibiting segregation in bus and train stations nationwide. The March on Washington was important because people from around the U.S. fought for civil rights together. This march was a tremendous success for civil rights and ended with Martin Luther's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. In 1964, President Johnson pushed a Civil Rights Act through Congress that prohibited discrimination in public places and promised equal opportunities in the workplace to all. The next year, the Voting Rights Act eliminated poll taxes, literacy requirements, and other tools that Southern whites had traditionally used to keep blacks from voting. And remember, peace, free love, and good vibes. In the beginning of the 1960s commenced the British invasion of music, accentuating the talent of bands such as the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Animals. These bands showcased American rock and roll and R&B influence in their sounds and dominated music charts until the mid-1960s. Since the Beatles entered the US music scene in 1963, they dominated worldwide charts until their breakup. Rock music and its branches also began to spread in the 1960s. Surf, psychedelic, and hard rock all became popular in the latter of the decade. The Beach Boys, the Jackson 5, Jimi Hendrix Experience, and Elvis Presley are all bands invested in the betterment of the music of the 1960s. Important songs of the 1960s include Hey Jude by the Beatles, The Twist by Chubby Checkers, Are You Lonesome Tonight by Elvis Presley. Yeah!
Are you lonesome tonight?
Hello, darlings. I'm here to talk about fashion. The emergence of even more commercial fashion opportunities meant that clothing as a status symbol was no longer confined to the wealthiest. Fashion could now be used to distinguish between levels within the middle class and even within the poorest classes in the United States. Fashion trends in the 1960s swung wildly from one end of the spectrum to the other for both men and women. The early 1960s were marked by box dresses and 1950s fashions. Enter 1966, where the look was much more sleek and modern. Polyester was a very common material, and skirts were short. As for hairstyles, from loose braids to beehives to headbands, the 1960s had it all. Like women, men wore basically the same thing in the early 60s as they did in the late 50s. By 1964, though, things started to change, such as pants becoming much tighter. The peacoat was quite popular for men in the mid-60s. The Beatles were leading the way as hair started to grow longer. At that time, women's clothes were becoming more masculine, while men's clothes were becoming more effeminate. By the beginning of the 1960s, television had cemented itself as a mainstream leisure activity as people began staying at home than visiting other venues. In the 1964 election, citizens observed the candidates Kennedy and Nixon for the first time on television, and it strongly influenced their vote. People began to rely on television for news and headlines, such as the number of American troops injured in Vietnam. TV became the center of every house as sitcoms such as Leave It to Beaver dominated the perspective of children. Sports began to soar during the 1960s, as the first Super Bowl was played in January 1967. Football began to emerge as America's favorite sport. The first two Super Bowls crowned the Green Bay Packers victorious. Also, basketball encapsulated the public during the decade as the Boston Celtics won 9 out of 10 championships. In addition, boxing dazzled audiences as Muhammad Ali showcased his fighting skills. American diets faced an ethnic clash as food became amalgamated of cultures such as French, Italian, and Japanese. Aside from mixes, the 1960s accentuated junk food as the first Wendy's restaurant opened in 1969. Many American families became acquainted with flaming meat and eating out at restaurants.